All right, well, the arrivals have slowed down. I'm sure people will keep trickling in, but I want to make very good use of our time today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Dr. Beth Cooper Benjamin. I am Director of Programs and Peer Networks here at the Jewish Funders Network. And in that capacity, I am the staff liaison for the Green Funders Forum in North America. And we are so pleased to have you all join us today for this session, which is, I think, a really critical piece of the puzzle of climate funding in this particular moment. So we are very glad to have you here, and we are incredibly grateful for our wonderful speakers today. Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, a JFN member who many of you know. She is as well as being a philanthropic leader, she is the representative for philanthropy on the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. So she has both a philanthropic and a policy background. She is a journalist and a blogger writing about climate issues. And she really knows the lay of this land in such a really rich and thoughtful way. We are so grateful to Jennifer for sharing her perspective today. And also grateful to Jennifer for connecting us with Lisa Friedman. Lisa is a climate policy reporter at the New York Times. I know many, if not all of you, have been reading her writing probably in the last 24 hours even, because there is plenty of climate policy news breaking. And Lisa has been a journalist for 30 years, and half of that time has been covering climate and looks at the Times really both at climate policy and its impact on communities. So we're also really grateful to have Lisa's perspective in this session. And the way this session is going to work, I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer, who's going to give a charge and an overview of climate funding opportunities for Jewish funders. And then Jennifer will invite Lisa to join her, and Lisa will give an overview of what she sees happening. And then we're going to open the whole thing up for questions for the bulk of the session. So I really invite you to take advantage of this opportunity to engage directly with both of our speakers. And then at the end, Lisa's going to jump off. She has lots to do today, I'm sure. And we will take the last 10 minutes of the hour and do some debriefing ourselves and talk about, have an opportunity to hear from you about what you are working on and focusing on in your own climate funding. Okay.
So thank you so much, Beth. I'm just going to pull up some slides, but I also want to point out that Maryland, I believe, is the only state that has a formal position for philanthropy on their climate commission in the country, and that there's actually two of us, and that Beth Harbor is the other one, and she is on this Zoom with us. So I want to point that out because I would love for all of you to encourage your governors and states to put a formal slot for philanthropy on your climate commissions in your state. So Lisa, it's just a real thrill to have you. Lisa has been reporting for 30 years, major, serious stuff, including being bureau chief for the LA Times and her work with Oakland.
LA Daily News.
And pardon?
LA Daily News, the
LA Daily News.
Smaller.
Yes, but also Climate Wire. She covered, energy and climate, and she's just really deep in this stuff. And 15 whole years, she really knows the breadth of it, but she does not cover philanthropy. And so I told her I'm going to spend just 5 minutes saying some of the things that people who are on this Zoom with her are involved in, so that she knows, but also I don't know that everybody on the Zoom knows what everybody else is doing. Now, we all know that climate change is just epically important. That's why we're all on this Zoom. But very little of philanthropy goes to climate causes. In fact, there's only 2% of global philanthropy, and there's a link to a report on this. So the work of the people who are willing to step up is even more important. A lot of people on this call are very involved in different nonprofits that educate the public and empower action on climate. So this could be climate journalism, it's Rewiring America, it's all the different groups that are doing front-facing education about climate, sometimes in our public schools or universities, et cetera. So there's a lot of education funding that is happening. Some of us are funding policy change, working with like Dayenu or Jewish Earth Alliance or groups like Sierra Club, LCV, et cetera, important parts of our portfolios. Some of us are funding court action, actually giving money to nonprofits that are essentially lawyers for the planet, whether it's Earth's Justice or Children's Trust, et cetera. It's another area people are involved in. A number of us are investing in climate journalism, whether it's nonprofits like GRIST or Canary Media, or Yale's climate program, or the one I'm on the board of at George Mason, but also seeing what's happening with public media, with NPR and PBS, et cetera. That's a big part of what people are funding. I personally am particularly excited about state policy. So there's the climate policy within our state policy nonprofit journalism. There's building coalitions. There's a lot of people sort of making their own Shabbos and not working together. I know a lot of us are really interested in more coalitions, and Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition is one of them that a lot are working on. Expanding access to climate finance, that's things like green banks and those sorts of things. A number of us are involved in that. Some of us are doing direct investments in climate solutions. Israel has 800 climate startup companies. And in fact, the Jewish Funders Network is co-sponsor in September of a trip that's coming up to look at companies and do a lot of investments in companies in Israel and also in the UAE. There's a part going to UAE, and there's a separate trip, I must say, that Arava Institute is doing that is on the environment and a lot of peace building in the Middle East. That's a very exciting trip in September. Some are doing Jewish and Israel climate leadership. There are over 50 different climate nonprofits or environmental nonprofits in Israel. They do have an umbrella organization that brings them all together to sit together. But, like anything else in the Jewish community, we always could use more coalition building and a less of making our own Shabbos. So that's something people are trying to build people together. And of course, now is really the time for us to do things. So I read Lisa every day. You don't file every day, but whenever you do file, I'm reading your articles. But the sum total of what is happening is so very different that I'm really looking forward to you giving us sort of the big picture of what those of us working in philanthropy should be thinking about, worrying about, preparing for in our journey. So thank you, Lisa, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to do this. And as Jennifer said, I mean, my area is not philanthropy or where activists and those who fund should be putting their attention. But what I can do is, walk you through what I'm seeing with this administration and, some where a lot of the action seems to be. Jennifer, so would it be best if I just spoke for a bit, and then I want to give you guys enough time.
Give
and
us
I'm
give
happy
us
to,
like 10 minutes of everything we should worry about or knew about or where there's some promise.
and I just want to by saying, I mean, I'm happy to take any questions you have, I'm happy to talk about the Times or, or the administration or what we're seeing. I'm constricted in, offering my personal opinions on things, but, it, you know, I have been covering climate change since the start of the Obama administration, climate policy. First at, I come a little bit about how I come to this. I'm an accidental climate reporter. I covered local news. I was the Washington bureau chief of the Oakland Tribune and the LA Daily News. There was no one else in the bureau. I was chief of me, covering a range of issues. And, as the newspaper industry sort of hits its bumps. I was climbing the ladder of newspapers and all the rungs fell out. And I landed really by accident at an amazing publication called E&E News, Climate Wire, covering fundamentally international issues on climate change. I got to Climate Wire thinking, oof, covering one issue, that's going to be boring. And I very quickly, came to the understanding that everyone who works in or studies or writes about this issue very quickly realizes that climate change is the story of everything and it touches everything and the enormous implications. And I really did not look back. I've covered 12 UN climate summits, covered the ups and downs in the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration. And the one thing that I would say is that while on a domestic level, we've seen over the past 15-ish years real whiplash when it comes to climate regulations, right? The Obama administration put in place car rules and the Clean Power Plan to address emissions from power plants, and other measures. And the first Trump administration rolled those back or weakened them. And the Biden administration put them back in some cases strengthened them. And we're seeing rollbacks again, but what we're really seeing is this administration, I would say, trying to rip out root to stem the ability to regulate in the future, which is about what the endangerment finding is about, and we can talk about that, but also eliminating funding for science to understand better the implications of climate change and what it means for communities, for programs that are helping communities adjust to and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. There are beginning efforts to go after states that are trying to work on various types of climate policy. And on an international level, we're seeing not just a pullout of the Paris Agreement, which we saw last time around, but a much more aggressive effort to push a fossil fuel future on other countries. I think we only have to look at the trade agreement a couple days ago, in which Europe has agreed to buy some $700 billion worth of US energy, oil and gas over the next 3 years. There's questions about whether that's even feasible, but that can there are many leaders in Europe who have expressed real worry about that as an effort to move the bloc away from its its climate change initiatives and lock them into more fossil fuels. So it's not a very uplifting start I'm giving you, but really what we've been covering over these past 6 months is the most aggressive attack on all things connected to climate change, on on a state, federal, and international level than we've ever seen. I don't know how to do this on Zoom, but would it be helpful if I give a little bit of an understanding of what EPA did announce yesterday on the endangerment finding and why that matters, why that's so
Please.
as I said, okay. And I don't want to tell folks things they already know, so please, stop me at any point. But I talked about the whiplash, right? The regulations that have been put in place and rolled back and put forward and rolled back. The endangerment finding is the source code, right? For all that. That is, in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in Massachusetts versus EPA that greenhouse gases are pollutants. And under the Clean Air Act, the EPA can regulate pollutants that harm human health and the environment. The endangerment finding was 200 more pages of scientific findings and legal findings that cumulatively explained how climate change is harming human health and why the EPA should regulate it. If that is successfully repealed, it eliminates the foundation for any regulations through the Clean Air Act at all for greenhouse gas emissions. It takes down emissions rules from automobiles, power plants, oil and gas wells, and the question of whether it can be reinstated is a little harder. It depends a lot on, there will be legal challenges. It depends on what a court rules and how they rule. The most extreme possibility is that the EPA could be barred from ever using something like this again and won't be able to regulate under the Clean Air Act. There are other possibilities in which the agency, a future president, could restore the finding. But as we all have learned this past 6 months, it's a lot easier to break something than to build something, right? And to replace the endangerment finding would take time. It would, and then to regulate after that, you're more than halfway through a 4-year term. So it's an enormous setback, and it gets at the fundamentals. And yet I'd also say that the reason we're in this predicament with the whiplash and with, the danger that repealing the endangerment finding poses is that Congress has yet to pass a law to, the reason we've been in this regulatory whiplash is because because Congress has not passed a law to address climate change, really. IRA aside and the funding for clean energy. The Obama administration back in the day said, if Congress isn't going to act, we will. And that's how the government under Democrats started using regulation as a tool for addressing climate change because Congress wasn't presenting any other tool. So, while this obviously will not be something that comes up in this Congress or, under Congress where there's a Republican majority in both houses, I think that has to be one of the big areas of focus is when Congress really is willing to take on climate change. The last major thing that I would note is the repeal of virtually all of the Inflation Reduction Act and, the questions that has raised for us as reporters, right? Just to recap, I mean, the bill, the law, the big beautiful, are we still calling it the big beautiful bill? President Trump's domestic policy and tax law that he signed earlier this month, repeals or weakens virtually all of the tax credits for wind and solar, most renewable energy. Just at a time when we were really starting to see big projects getting built, particularly in Republican areas, districts and states. So what happened, right? I mean, I think as reporters, a lot of us are starting to, now that we have a moment to breathe, the first 6 months, the first big heave of changes that has kept us on a hamster wheel, has died down a bit. And I think this is a moment for reflection. And we've started to talk to a lot of members of, leaders of environmental movements, lawmakers, about why they think the IRA was ultimately able to be killed after, despite all of the benefits to, Republican areas. There's some interesting thinking around that. Folks are starting to think about what comes next and and how and where the climate movement goes from here. I'm a listener to those conversations. I'm as much interested in hearing your perspectives on something like that, and what the climate movement would do given another chance, and what lessons have been learned. So I don't think I'm the one to relay what those are. I think that is I could tell you what I am hearing from various folks, but I think that's a conversation that, maybe we can also have broadly. Why don't I stop there and see if folks have questions for me? And I can always go on, but better for you to ask.
This was very helpful, Lisa, for set the table for us as we think about these policies. Our chair for the Jewish Funders Network Green Funders Group is Tamara, and I think she had a question, if I'm not mistaken. Were you?
So many. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jennifer. That was grim. I knew it was going to be a rough, you know. Um, as people formulate their questions, I'll just throw out a couple of the things that have been on my mind and pick whichever one you want or answer something else, of course. You're such a wealth of information. Um, I'm thinking about the New York Times 50 States, 50 Fixes project.
Yes.
And curious um, what the focus on state law is now. I'm a little, obviously, it sounds like the administration is trying to interrupt that as well, but what impact the state and local level can have. And philanthropists can talk about that afterwards, but I'm curious about that. And number two, um, how you see, or if you see, the Republican conservation movement having any impact at all. When the national parks shutdown happened, there was a hue and cry from a lot of Republican conservationists, and it felt like maybe that had some impact. And I'm curious if you know about that avenue as well.
So let me take a couple things. First, states. Just to go back to 50 states, 50 fixes. I don't know if others have seen, but this is a project that my colleagues Katrin Einhorn and Kara Buckley have been leading, and it's really an effort. There's not a lot of good news on the apocalypse beat, and this is an effort that they have launched to look at some of the really interesting, in many cases, innovative. Consequential moves that states and sometimes very local, groups, activists and others have done to address climate change, and really highlight some of the things that are happening outside of government all over the country. It's delightful. Also, there's great stories. It makes me feel better often after a long day of covering the destruction of government. And I do think that that states are heavily where the action is. I also, though, see states struggling to figure out uh, what the next big thing they can do to address climate change is, right? The states that politically have been able to create, for example, clean electricity standards. They've done it. I don't see many more states being able to do it. So I think, I'm not as plugged into the state level actors, but I have seen, some level of this isn't going to come out right. it's not more words than action. Like, but you know, I mean, state actors want to do a lot on climate change. I haven't seen many new policies coming out of the states yet. I'm sorry, what was the other?
The Republican conservation
Oh,
movement, and but
it's
it
pretty
like
interesting. Like, you know, I mean, they've gone through some transformations, but you know, there are a number of very interesting Republican groups that, you know, are active on climate change and clean energy. They are, at the moment, not as influential as they, you know, as they were, right? Like we're in a moment where this administration is not listening to those voices in their party. And there is clearly, they're not as outspoken as folks in the climate community would have liked them to be around things like the IRA. There's clearly, you know, one can assume fear of criticizing the administration, criticizing too much. But you know, these groups are still here and active, and I think they are working in good faith to try to figure out, you know, a, a conservative solution to climate change that can be embraced within the party. And I think Heather Reams is doing a lot of interesting work. There's a gentleman named Benji Backer who has a group called Nature's, I think it's new, Nature's Nonpartisan, I think it is. You know, he did a lot of work to protect public lands in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think there's you know, it's a difficult moment for the small number of conservative groups that work on climate change, but you know, they're still trying to, they're still alive, they're still working. And I think that they're really trying to work in good faith.
thank you, Lisa.
Lisa, I see two questions in the chat, one of which is, do you see an impact in climate journalism from the nonprofit, nonprofit climate journalism? And there's another question about, do you think there's a particular opportunity for investors to support innovation?
So this gets into an area where I'm afraid I'm not too well versed. I think there is a role for philanthropic investments in climate journalism. You know, there are organizations like Floodlight News, which is run by a woman named Emily Holden, and it is a small but mighty group of investigative journalists who focus on climate change and energy. And they have done some tremendous reporting around utilities and corruption. That's one that just comes to mind immediately. I'm sure there's others. But I think the broadening of journalism generally means that there is a role for philanthropy. I just, you know, it's just not my prime area, I'm afraid.
So I'm going to have two questions taken at a time. So Yossi and Michael, if you can each ask your questions, then we'll take Julie and Jenny so that Lisa can sort of pick and choose on her answers.
Hey, thank you, Jennifer. As always, Lisa, like a big honor. And Michael, there's so many friends here. My name is Yossi. I created with partners the solar industry here in Israel and in Sub-Saharan Africa, utility scale, even Gaza with someone else here from the Arava Institute, and done a couple solar fields and innovations in the US. My question is, for those of us who really cared and needed the tax credits, the solar tax credits, I saw that energy storage didn't get killed at all. So is there a model by which we can use the energy storage, the batteries, as a way to still make solar projects work, whether I put in the chat with historically black colleges, which is one of the things we're doing as a nonprofit, or with Mitchell with the Solar Jewish Challenge, I'm sure he'll say hello, or low-income housing. Is there a fix? Is there a way in through the tax credits for energy storage that solar can still work and scale?
So we'll get Michael's question too, and then Lisa can do a twofer.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm actually going to ask something that's Yossi related, but not related to storage, or not primarily related to storage. And it really is two very, very different questions. You mentioned how the IRA has been basically killed in many ways. Another thing that was helping in this area was US aid.
Yeah.
And particularly, and I'm saying this as a board member of Yossi's company. So I don't know what I'm allowed to say on the record, so he'll slap me later.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Proceed.
So we had a number of things that were in development where we were getting funding from USAID to do the pre-development on projects that eventually become commercial projects. So there's a lot of pre-development money that essentially, if you want to think of it, not that it's pure philanthropy per se, but grant/philanthropy type money can get magnified 20 to 25 times in terms of actual development on the back end. So from the government standpoint, it's an incredible, wonderful leverage. And in particular, and this is where I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say, but I'll say it anyhow, we're working with, or trying to work with, a number of foundations to kind of fill in the holes from USAID. So Rockefeller is part of a consortium that has this Mission 300 plan, which is to get electricity to 300 new people in Africa, 300 million new people in Africa by the year 2030. And we, meaning Gigawatt Global, Yossi's company, we can actually achieve 10% of that for them, meaning of the 300 million people they're trying to hit, we can provide electricity in the next 5 years for 30 million people if we had the right funding, starting now, et cetera. So we're trying to work with them on that front, but it's a slog because it was a lot easier when you had one source to deal with, then they could fund something, as opposed to obviously a bunch of foundations, each with their own bureaucracies, et cetera. So I guess what I'm asking, just to turn this long-winded thing into a question, is, are you seeing philanthropy/foundations kind of filling in the gap from USAID?
Okay, so to take these two together, first of all, and I apologize for having to, I'm not trying to back out of questions. There are things that I know well, like the politics of addressing climate change and failing to, and there's things that I know less well, like technology, philanthropy. On energy storage broadly, I mean, it it's had a major impact. Feels like somebody let let the Senate know. It did pretty, as you say, it did pretty well in the final bill. I don't know that I can answer honestly your question specifically about it, though I could recommend other reporters that might be good to talk to who cover the technology part of the clean energy transition more than I do. On philanthropy sort of taking the place of USAID, one place I have found this to be true is in, we've covered the dismantlement of FEMA, right? And we found that in many cases, sort of ad hoc volunteer groups are trying to fill a gap left by FEMA. And I mean, it really feels like it is hard to be a substitute for the government. I'm sure there is a role that philanthropy can play in this space. I just think that I'm not the best one to speak to that. I'm so sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Julie and then Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Michael, your words were they highly resonated. In my day job, I work for the International Finance Corporation. We did a lot of work helping to set up the Global Energy Alliance, which is what you're speaking about, as an implementing partner for Mission 300. When I first got on this call, one of the first things that came to my mind was, how do we engage smaller donors in larger coalitions? And I think that's something that we're all really trying to think about. There's a lot of donors in the Jewish community, and we're trying to think about how do we take action on the things that are Jewishly important to ourselves, but also important to the world, like climate. And so I'm just kind of, parroting and echoing this. I personally am deeply interested in trying to figure out how Jewish donors can get involved in these large issues while maintaining our voice. So that's more of a comment. But my question kind of builds on what you were saying, Michael, which is USAID went away, and investors are also getting really shy. I've personally fielded startups in Israel requesting IFC to come in the place of venture investors who have changed terms at the last minute because of the war. And there's a need for early stage funding. The organization that I work for right now doesn't go that early stage, but there's got to be a role for philanthropy to kind of come in and meet that need. And so I guess my question to everyone is, as we see these headwinds, whether they're US politics, whether they're, disappearing funding sources, whether they're diminishing risk appetites for Israel because of the war and everything else, how do we as philanthropists come together and think about solutions while maintaining our own voice? And I feel like maybe that question bleeds into other groups at JFN that have to do with, the investor roundtable and perhaps kind of linking this climate discussion with that. But it's something that I'd be really interested in engaging with anyone that would like to. So sorry if it's more of a comment than a question, but really appreciate this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Jenny?
Great to see you, Lisa. Two questions. One is just following up on this conversation about state work. In the context of the decimation of the IRA, state work obviously becomes even more important in terms of the acceleration of clean energy. And all along, that's where implementation of the IRA is going to be happening. And one of the places that we've been working and seeing lots of folks working is around state Superfund acts. Something's called Make Polluters Pay, where the polluters passing bills for polluters to invest in impacted communities and adaptation to the climate crisis. And that's happened in a few states, and there are major kind of battles in other states. And I'm curious if you're seeing momentum grow around those Superfund acts. And then my other question is just where you're seeing the unique added value of faith communities and faith voices. One of the things I know we've found is the power of being able to work like both as an insider and an outsider, but like agitating and also kind of having the gravitas to sit down with leaders on the inside and raising up a moral voice in what is ultimately, a moral crisis as well as an ecological one, and just where you're seeing that in this fraught moment having particular impact.
Well, to the first point, I mean, the Trump administration is going hard at these Superfund laws. It is suing multiple states and arguing that they are unconstitutional, exceed state authority, right, in New York, Vermont. They've, these cases are still in play, but, I haven't seen other states adopt them while these lawsuits are going on. And I think that was part of the point, right? Like the Trump administration is really trying to strike fear into states. the administration also sued the state of Hawaii. Why am I blanking on it? They like before they Honolulu Hawaii had not even enacted its Superfund law, and the Trump administration preemptively sued to stop it. So, you know, that route might still bear fruit for states, but it's obviously fraught. And I do wonder if there aren't, maybe more, if folks are looking at, well, I don't know. Like, I don't know how, is it better to focus on lawsuits versus practical things like, energy storage or, investments in businesses that will, make changes on the ground, on the grid? That's for others to decide, but these lawsuits are certainly designed to strike fear in states. The other question on
Faith.
Superfund laws and what else?
Oh, faith voices and the role
Oh,
of
faith voices have been incredibly important. I mean, I think that they, one of the 50 by 50 stories we did was by my colleague Katrin on evangelical groups who have been, very active on environmental protection. I, I think that I don't know if this administration more than others, but I think that that is, a deeply important voice in this debate. And I don't think, I don't feel like they've grown much since I have been covering this issue is the one thing I'd say, like I've been covering, for example, the, evangelical groups who are active on climate change for some, 15 years. The movement does not feel to me as if it has grown much. And that's something that I'm curious about, does it not have traction within its own religious community? Is there pushback on, from other faith elements around, other parts of the politics? I can't say it, but I do think it's an incredibly important voice, and it's one that, newspapers like ours highlight often.
Thank you, Lisa. Yuval. And then others should go ahead and show your questions. Just raise your hand for getting in the queue. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Thanks for your knowledge and your time. I'm based in New York. I invest in climate solutions, but as a philanthropist and doing funding and philanthropy, I've not found so many things that speak to me so far. Not that I've done a big deep dive in the area of climate. But what I usually fund is things that are more strategic, political, lobbying, that kind of thing. I was wondering if you or if anybody else on this call has any recommendations in that area.
I mean, maybe this isn't directly applicable to your question, but I'll raise something that Jennifer and I talked about briefly yesterday, which was, I mentioned at the top of my remarks that, we're starting to have these conversations with activists, lawmakers, others about sort of lessons learned from Trump's election, from, the death of most of the IRA, from, the past administration. And there's lots of opinions. So, take this for what it was, which was one deeply involved person's perspective. But, the one person that I talked to felt that the Inflation Reduction Act really got it right, you know, the carrots, the investments for clean energy, and where this person felt the world of climate activism had not done as well, and by extension, his take, climate philanthropy, was after the IRA passed, a, you know, you saw a real difficulty in climate activists building new bridges and coalitions with chambers of commerces, with business groups, with, you know, developers, with even gas groups with whom there are obviously big disagreements. And that, again, this person's words, most climate philanthropy went toward environmental justice. And, you know, while this person wasn't debating whether that was right or wrong, it didn't serve to build new coalitions that did not previously exist for climate groups. And that contributed to, you know, not having the political juice to retain some of the provisions of the IRA. One might also think that, you know, when you have a president that is as vociferously against wind, solar, electric vehicles, you know, you're gonna lose a lot of this stuff anyway, no matter the politics. So, you know, but it was an interesting point to me, and I just kind of raise it as
Right.
something to think about.
But if I
But
understand what you're saying is the lessons learned is that, okay, now obviously we're in an awful situation, but, you know, when things hopefully change, we need to be in a better, stronger, more organized position to take advantage of legislation that passes. And so I guess
being able to build, being willing to build, not saying, you know, no to everything. I mean, climate activists know how to prevent things, how to block projects, but, you know, the IRA was about building stuff, and yes, it didn't get passed until 2022, lost a lot of time, but there were real problems in getting stuff actually built.
and are you seeing people out there who are trying to build and again learn from these lessons?
Well, I think that in Washington, that debate is moving to a discussion over permitting and permitting reform. And, you know, that didn't go anywhere under Biden. The dynamics were difficult, right? There were many Republicans who did not want to address transmission because they felt that that would honestly help the Biden administration, help make, you know, the IRA work. There were a lot of Democrats who didn't want to move an inch on allowing an easier time for pipelines and other fossil fuel projects. You know, I think now maybe some Democrats and climate activists wish they had the type of compromises that were on the table uh, back in 2024. We're in a different political world, but that discussion over how do we actually get stuff built is moving to the permitting discussion.
Lisa, we're going to release you in just a moment here, but I'm going to take so that we can discuss amongst ourselves, but I'm going to take a moderator's privilege to ask you a question about, so a lot of us have experienced, unfortunately, anti-Semitism in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And one of those places, sadly, has been in the climate movement. And also a lot of us are very disappointed in Lee Zeldin, who you wrote about today, who is Jewish and doing horrific anti-science, anti-environmental policy as EPA chief. So I just wondered if you could comment about, do you see sort of that anti-Semitism or the Jewish question at all in the federal policy that you are covering in a time when there's a lot of conversations about what is happening in Gaza or Israel?
Not directly. I will say not directly. I mean, I think, you know, I think there are a lot of us struggling with how we think about our place in a world of activism that seems to be increasingly anti-Israel, right? The climate, I mean, there are any number of environmental, I mean, it started out with just one or two, but any number of environmental groups have decided that they needed to have something to say about the war. And, you know, I think we haven't seen this. I guess I'd say a couple things. I think reporters like myself are uneasy writing about this tension. And we can get into that in the next conversation. And yet it doesn't feel to me like it has risen to, you know, something that we're grappling with in terms of federal policy. You know, you know, I think about this a lot, and you know, I think what we're seeing from, you know, let's take Lee Zeldin, for example. I mean, he's, you know, we've really separated the issues of faith and environmental protection, or he has really. You know, I'm a little all over the place. Tighten your question and I'll try and answer it better.
Do you think that Jews are having a harder time
Yes.
working in the climate community and having an impact in federal policy because of the
I'm
environment?
having a harder time covering things, right? There are some, you know, I mean, I'll just tell you as a group, I mean, there are some activists that I just can't bring myself to quote anymore because of statements I've seen from them on other issues. There are, you know, I can't see how it has bled into everything. How has it not bled into this? You know, I mean, and it's, you know, you have a activist community that considers intersectionality to be very important, right? They see climate change as wrapped into many issues, and I think that is an enormous challenge for those of us who care very much about Israel and care very much about the climate.
So Lisa, you have been tremendous, so generous with your time. We so appreciate your reporting. We're gonna continue our conversation without you, but with so much inspiration from your leadership and for your telling us the story and the facts every day. So
Thank you
thanks,
so
Lisa, for
much.
joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Turning it back to Beth.
All right. Well, I feel like some of what we had intended for this last segment, you all have already begun in terms of sharing about what you individually are working on, and starting to connect with each other around common interests and challenges, but that is very much core to the mission of this group. So we invite you now, if you have not had an opportunity to speak about the things that you are working on, to reflect on some of the insights and the takeaways for you from what you heard today from both Jennifer and Lisa. Please, we welcome anyone to jump in and take the floor for a moment. I realize we don't have very long left in this session, but we would welcome hearing from anyone who hasn't had an opportunity to speak.
So since nobody's jumping in, I will just say that Lisa spoke very highly of Floodlight, and I used to fund them, and that we fund a lot of climate journalism, but that the CEO or the head person at Floodlight was at a panel and said incredibly anti-Semitic things. And so I invited that person to have a conversation on the side. That person was unwilling to say that Israel should exist as a country. And so they're no longer on our funder list of the organizations that we fund. And so I just wanted to say, as a funder, they do tremendous work. people will have different opinions on who and why they fund, but it was definitely an issue for me.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, Mitch.
Hi, I just want to say thank you, Jennifer. You're in an interesting position in the communications world, coming from a deep background in communications and politics. So the more you could do these kinds of things and expose us to some of the great writers is really wonderful. So just thank you for that.
Thanks for what you do, Mitch, particularly on solar. So Tamara?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this group, that's the function of this group, is so that we can share information, have more impact, have community, work together, all of that. And we'll be sending out a survey in the not too distant future, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on what kinds of topics are interesting and how you'd want to have what would be the most meaningful and impactful for all of us as green funders in North America. And yes, thank you so much for Beth and Gil and Jennifer to put this together. And I look forward to having more in person and online, and whatever feels helpful for all of us.
So let me add a couple things. One is that I write a blog for Times of Israel on the intersection of climate and the Jewish community or Israel. And all of my stories until now have been positive 100% on people doing good work. So if you're supporting something important and interesting that you think other people should know about, please just let me know, because maybe I can do an article about it and give it more exposure. My two most recent articles, which were put in the chat, are on two really exciting opportunities coming up to go to Israel and do incredible climate work. One is Rachel has a great trip coming up with the Arava Institute. So if you're interested in climate and particularly using it as peace building, that is really an exceptional opportunity. The other one that the Jewish Funders Network is involved in is really more for impact investors who want to look at technology, want to look at solutions for sustainable agriculture, et cetera. Those are really exciting trips that are both happening in September. And if you are insanely ambitious, you could actually attend parts of both of them and see both groups. They're both incredible opportunities. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful to JFN that it has Gil and Tamara putting staff work into this. I'm really grateful to Tamara doing this in the US and also Marla Stein, who's doing this in Israel. But this survey that you're going to get from the Green group now is really important for people to fill out, because it's really all about us and each of you and what you want to see this group accomplish and how we can be helpful. So please, everyone, when you get the survey, please take the time, and thank you all for what you're doing.
Thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you to Jennifer for your expertise and your leadership in this session. And thank you also to Tamara and to Gil and Marla Stein again, and Gil and Marla especially for sharing information about this session with the group at their session last week. Have a great day, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session.